so that when new issues pop up, when misunderstandings, misalignments, missignaling happens, it's not just immediate Cold War mentality of breaking apart. It's an understanding that I know these people, I know this country, I know that they are the partner and ally of the United States, and so I don't immediately just think the worst. I go and reach out to communicate and coordinate and understand where we misaligned. So I think that's why the youth are critical.
I was so touched. So hi everyone, welcome to TogetherWeTri Podcast. It is the first episode and we have Matthew Fleming here with me. So hi Matthew.
Hello, great to be here.
Yeah, so could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Matthew Fleming. I'm currently a Ph.D. student at Northeastern University. I'm also a graduate fellow at the Center of International Affairs and World Cultures, and currently a non-resident Kelly Korea fellow with the Pacific Forum.
Great. So actually we are now in Hawaii for the Young Trilateral Leaders Workshop, Alumni Workshop. So today I like to delve into Matthew's personal story about his journey with the trilateral. So I think you've studied both at Yonsei, Keio in Tokyo, right? And now you're pursuing the Ph.D. in US. And your background literally explains your trilateral, but I think it's very unusual path as well. So what drew into so deeply into trilateral? And also sharing your experience to living in each country?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting way that it kind of developed kind of naturally over time. When I was really young, my father worked for a Japanese company, and so he had the fortunate opportunity to do managerial training in Japan. And so when he came back, he had these stories, different souvenirs, and I thought it was really interesting. And so as I grew older, got more interested into government, politics, those different topics, not only did I look outwards from the US, I started looking outwards from Japan. What was Japan's relationship with other countries? What was the US relationship with other countries? And so when I needed to study abroad as part of my undergrad degree, I chose Nagoya. I went to Nagoya for about 6 months there as an exchange student. And it was really a really enjoyable time. I loved all the different culture, the people, the time, and so I really wanted to go back. And so for my master's, I decided I would go back to Asia and I would pursue a master's degree. I ended up going to Yonsei in South Korea during COVID, actually, during 2020. But while there, fell in love with Korea, fell in love with all the different cultures, the people, the food. It was a really great time. And I was fortunate enough to get selected for a Yonsei Keio dual degree program. Where Yonsei and Keio partner to basically allow students to go back and forth, 1 or 2 per semester, to pursue 2 degrees, one at Yonsei, one at Keio, and live in both countries. And so I lived in Korea, in Seoul, for about 1.5 years to get my master's at Yonsei in Global Affairs and Policy, and then moved to Yokohama at Keio for 1.5 years and got my second master's in Global Affairs and Policy. Basically, during that time, initially my research focus was specifically on Japan-Korea relations and the history, how that developed. But the longer I was there and the more advanced I got into my research, I kind of started asking the question, what is it that I can contribute to the relationship? And as an American, the question kind of started building is what is the role of the US in the region? What has the role of the US been in this relationship between Korea and Japan? I mean, it's a very long historical relationship with a lot of nuances. And so when I decided to write my master's thesis, it really hinged on that idea of what has the history of US involvement been for facilitating the trilateral, from the Obama pivot to the Biden administration to, at that time, the Trump administration. So it was a really kind of natural development, which started off as kind of a more cultural interest into a country that slowly developed as I developed and got older, interested in politics, interested in relations, and then living and studying in those countries. The trilateral kind of became my initial connection to the countries as well. I was an American living and studying in the 3 countries, trying to build the connection. And so coming back to the US to pursue my PhD, that became kind of the focal point and expanded into more regional observations on minilateralism as a whole and the larger structures that are building.
Wow, I think I was very inspired that your experience, you turn into your experience to write the impact, and also you kind of want to see as a US perspective, see the Korea-Japan relationship from the US perspective in a very keen way. So that was inspiring. And also moving on to the second question, you are the delegate of 2024 YTL Summit in Busan, and the very same program that gave birth to the Together We Try. So what was a moment during that summit that genuinely surprised you or changed you? Something about how you think about the trilateral cooperation as the next generation youth?
Yeah, I think the Busan Summit came at a really critical moment, following up on Camp David and basically trying to create more institutionalized partnership. And one of those, of course, we have all the policy areas that we're developing and strengthening the relationship in new ways. But I think the youth component was a really important one for the people-to-people component, because establishing relations at all levels, from the highest level summit diplomacy, policy, to the working groups, to just individual people who will enter into the field and care about the relationship moving forward, I think it was a really critical initiative. And so me, just finishing up my second master's at Keio and moving back to the US, it came at also a really important part in my career trajectory about where was I going to go next. Was I going to be more academic? I was waiting for Ph.D. application results. And so to get selected, to get to go to Busan in between that area and connect with other like-minded people from all the different countries who cared about the same kind of relationship that might have been a little bit more nuanced or a little bit more not as popular a couple years before the Camp David. Now, I mean, you see the trilateral everywhere. But it was really great to see all these people. But also, it wasn't only the area that like I might have focused in on, which at that time was really just security and FOIP ideas, but people who were looking at the trilateral at all levels, teachers interacting, diplomats, economics. It was interacting with them was really important. And for me, something that really was mostly impactful and kind of selfishly, because it's one of the only opportunities I got to moderate a fireside chat with the U.S. Ambassador, Philip Goldberg. And so getting to have that opportunity to do a fireside chat with a sitting U.S. Ambassador to Korea, I mean, that's like a one-in-a-lifetime type moment. So that was really critical for me because it shows what we can do, and also the government's commitment to fostering the relationship moving forward and reaching out to not just the most established senior heads, but also people who are working at the lower levels, who are your normal policy fellows, your research associates, your research assistants, who are putting together a lot of that work that builds into the reports that you're reading. And so I think that was a really critical moment as well.
Right. And as you mentioned, like surrounded by like-minded people make me confidence to keep this journey ahead.
Yeah. Always.
Right, so I like to ask more about your research and the thesis that you're working on. So your research centers on the minilateralism and small group partnerships like the US, ROK, Japan triangle. So in plain terms, why does this specific trilateral matter so much right now? And what would actually be lost if the three countries drifted apart?
Yeah, no, I think, so for those who are as familiar with minilateral relationships, they're small groupings of countries focused on specific regional or security issues that are more flexible than larger multilateral connections. So by having just these more mostly informal partnerships, they can focus in on targeted areas and issue areas and adapt and be more flexible to address them than they could on their own, on only a bilateral form or in a larger multilateral form. And so the ones that we're most familiar with, of course, US, ROK, Japan, a critical one, but also Quad, ARCIS, US, Japan, Philippines. In the Indo-Pacific, minilateralism has been one of the most growing impact to a more networked approach to security and cooperation and building the region. Compared to Europe, which is a very integrated European Union style, or the larger Western NATO type structure. So minilateralism is really critical for understanding how the region kind of cooperates and works on some of these issues. US, ROK, Japan is quite critical because they're some of the strongest US security allies in the region, right? We call them the linchpin, we call them the cornerstone. They're historically, since post-World War II, critical allies for the United States, as well as critical positions in the region on the first island chain, and trying to protect a free and open Indo-Pacific. I think losing Korea and Japan is basically not an option for the U.S. if we want to keep our actual goals for producing a resilient Indo-Pacific that is free from coercion, as well as inclusive and protective of all the values that we pursue for the region as a whole. I think, and to pursue that, only on a bilateral method between the US and the ROK, or just the US and Japan, would critically miss out on what we need to build for interoperability to react in critical junctures. In crisis moments, we have to be able to work together as a team, and we have to be able to respond in milliseconds. We have to be able to communicate, share data, and not have to go through the United States. In the past, a hubs and spoke system such as like TISA, the Trilateral Information Sharing Agreement, meant that information had to go through the US. Producing like Josimia, where Korea and Japan can share information directly, the commitment to coordinate after Camp David, these are critical moments that produce the ability for us to work together in these critical moments, when in the past it might have been more slow, or it might have been hindered by the limitations between the relationship. So I think that's what we would lose if the trilateral starts breaking down into only bilateral engagement structures.
Right. I think you point out at all the important points, and also like how should we more delve into it. Okay, great. And then so I think it's moving on to your thesis, to your actual work and your actual initiative they're doing. So you've worked inside and could you introduce about the organization that you're leading or initiative that you're leading, and what did that experience teach you about the gap between how trilateral cooperation looks on the paper versus how it actually gets done by the day-to-day or in the action?
Yeah, I think right now, as I said, I'm a Ph.D. student at Northeastern University, and as part of that, luckily I've been able to become a graduate fellow at one of the centers there, the Center for International Affairs and World Cultures. And as part of that role at the center, I was lucky enough to be allowed to launch a Global Ideas Lab, which is a program that we have at the center to allow faculty and graduate students to launch spaces to do interdisciplinary work, to convene meetings, to work on reports, to work on basically creating something together that they wouldn't be able to do on their own or singularly in their own discipline. And so through the Global Ideas Lab, I launched the Indo-Pacific Minilateral Cooperation Ideas Lab, and the working group looking at the future of minilateralism's promotion of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And so that is a really personal initiative for me, because it's a way to bridge singular solar isolated kind of dissertation research with more networked collaboration with people who are in current policy positions at different think tanks. And the majority of them are from the YTL network that we met in Busan. Some are from the Osaka summit that I've met through other exchanges later, coming back to visiting Japan and Korea whenever I can. And so collaborating with them to build basically a larger report that we're all co-authoring, and then doing maybe different engagements here and there for closed door roundtables or different panels to basically promote research that bridges that academic policy divide. Sometimes academics, we're writing these very long reports that are investigating swaths of histories at times, and policy can sometimes be very immediate, just responding to the most recent news story, and finding that bridge where you're providing policy prescriptions that are based in more rigorous academic analysis is very valuable. At least I believe it is. And so getting to collaborate with these great individuals from Busan and the YTL network to co-author this report is something that I think is really great. And I'm very fortunate that the University, Northeastern, and my boss, Maya K. Davis Cross, and the Center of International Affairs and World Cultures is providing me the space to get to pursue those kind of things. So excited to continue working on that, and should be coming out in the next couple months.
Great. I think when people gather, idea comes out and they want to make an impact on it. So I think the report they're working on a policy proposal, that means a lot. Great. So I think we have 2 questions left.
Okay. Yeah.
So TogetherWeTri is built on the belief of that we, next generation, has a real role to play shaping in this relationship. And from where you sit and both a researcher and a summit alumni, what do you think we youth can do that diplomats or policymakers generally cannot?
Yeah, so one, just at the surface level, I think youth are critical in any ambition, because they are the ones who inherit the future outcomes of any report, any policy, any agreement. So if you want to establish credible legitimacy and a policy and an agreement and a peace negotiation and any kind of future ambition, you have to have the future stakeholders as part of the process. You have to have them in the design, you have to have them in the negotiations, you have to have them there. If you only inherit policies or inherent structures later in life, the credibility is kind of lost. The legitimacy is hindered, and so the long-term credibility of those agreements will be not as strong as they could be. So I think that's already critical for why youth need to be involved in any of the processes. And I think governments, they recognize this. They're not always implementing the processes the best they can be. There's limited ways to always reach out. Sometimes it can feel a little bit sidelined where it's only presence and not power in it. But the fact that governments are doing initiatives like the Y programs with YPL, YTL, YSEALI shows that they recognize that youth are critical for this. The United Nations does the youth security, where they're trying to reach out to give youth a seat in some of these processes and have a voice and contribute to understanding what matters to them. That recognition shows that they understand that they're quite critical. And so I think why they're also so critical is because each generation grows up experiencing the world differently. We're all impacted by external conditions that are different as time evolves. That's not just the evolution of technology, but the social cultural issues that impacted us in our youth impact us now and our relationships with those. And so if you only have subsets of the population, i.e. just like some educated from certain institutions or some generations from only certain areas, you're missing out on the largest population or the largest people who will be impacted by this. And moreover, youth specifically, historically have been at the center for so many movements that have pushed new ideas that counter conventional thinking on university campuses and government institutions and programs. And so I think leveraging that is critical. Losing that, you're hindering your ability to actually move things forward, progress new ideas, as well as signal legitimacy of actually representing the full population. For the US ROK Japan, that means signaling the future of the relationship means the future of the people who will be in the relationship. We're constantly trying to strengthen the countries together. And so if we're strengthening them looking forward, that means strengthening the youth's connections in the three countries, so that when new issues pop up, when misunderstandings, misalignments, missignaling happens, it's not just immediate Cold War mentality of breaking apart. It's an understanding that I know these people, I know this country, I know that they're the partner and ally of the United States. And so I don't immediately just think the worst. I go and reach out to communicate and coordinate and understand where we misaligned. So I think that's why the youth are critical.
I was so touched, and I was inspired how you view the world, separated into the generation, and also in a national level as well, and as youth, the future stakeholder, and also youth that living in the era, the current era.
Yeah.
I think you definitely put the significance on our generation. Yeah. Thank you. And the next question, it's more to the looking ahead. So if the US ROK Japan trilateral relationships looks back in 10 years and says that generation of young leaders made a difference, what do you hope they actually did?
I mean, it's a tough one, right? Because I think, like I mentioned before, young leaders need to be in as many conversations as they can be and connected to as many parts of the process. And I think it's also kind of a misnomer at times. We always say the youth, or we say young people, and we only look for specific youth programs for them, right? So I mean, there's YTL, right? There's TogetherWeTri, there's all these different networks, not just for this relationship, but all relationships of young people. Specific issue areas like climate, we look at youth movements, but youth age. Youth get older, they enter normal positions of policy, of power, and different hierarchy statuses, and they don't just lose the ambitions and goals that they had when they were in youth moments. And so I think we would be misguided if we only look towards youth movements to understand where youth have had impact. We need to look at how they have continued to age in the process, join different movements, continued after they continue to age. For example, I know, I think the federal limit for US has been 35 for youth programs, right? just because we had someone here in YTL at 34 and now they're 36 doesn't mean they stopped caring about the trilateral, doesn't mean they stopped writing the research or doing their part. And so I think what's important to look at is not just what youth are doing currently in their youth movements or youth now, but look at the trajectory that youth have been. And so I think if we look back like 10 years from now and we say youth made a difference in the relationship, it would be that the youth stuck with it. That the people who engage with the relationship now, when it's like maybe at its highest point in popularity for academic or policy discourse, you know, following Camp David into different relationships, the people who cared about it before trying to get the initial cooperation when the relationship was at its worst, when like individual conflicts were kind of dominating discussion, cared about it during Camp David when it was at its peak, and care about it moving forward for the next 10 years as key parts of their research, their policy, their ambition, their relationships. They just are just visiting and continuing the relationships between the countries. To me, that should be one of the biggest indicators that young people have continued to make a large impact 10 years down the road, is that they continue to care. They continue to care about the relationship, and they want to highlight that in their own individual work, not just when they were individually a part of a youth-specific program.
Right, because like as you mentioned, like youth ambitious and like youth are ambitious, but like we don't lose ambition and also like we're getting, I think if I use this word like mature, like in terms of like maturing in the experience, maturing in on the journey of making the shoes dirty, and like they're like keep moving forward, like keeping the journey ahead, like for the lifetime, like so it's not just for the youth era that we can do things, like it's the building up the foundation, I believe.
Always, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so it was great.
Oh yeah, thank you so much.
It was
for
great
having me.
to know more about your thoughts on trilateral and your like dedication to go on this journey.
That was fantastic. It's always great to see you and the TogetherWeTri team and everybody here in YTL and Hawaii. And so it's great to talk, and I look forward to continue seeing how TWT continues to evolve. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.